Megan Burke. I am the President and CEO of the Community Foundation of Western Mass. This is our conference room, which is a community space. And I always kind of mention that and make the plug. If you know of folks who need a community space, we make this available. We have something on our website, or we can connect you to the person who does that. But I just want to mention that because we used to do that, and then COVID hit, and everyone went away, and now we're kind of bringing everyone back. So thank you for being here. Our Evolve series began in 2020 to reintroduce philanthropy through an equity lens and to engage and connect members of our community to learn how they can be part of this work. Through our relaunch series, which is starting today, you're right in at the beginning, each session has been designed to introduce one of our 5 strategic priorities. So some of you may be aware that the Community Foundation went through a strategic planning process in 2019 with all kinds of energy and enthusiasm. In sort of very early 2020, we announced our strategic vision to focus on equity and opportunity for all residents of Western Mass. We identified 5 priorities, and then a week later, we were all in lockdown. But that did not deter us. We quickly responded to immediate community needs through our COVID response fund, but at the same time, we were continuing to do the work to advance these priorities and be ready when we were able to refocus on them. And these priorities, I'm going to start with the first one, which is what this session is aligned with. That is diversity, equity, and inclusion within the Community Foundation and in all the work that we do. Our second is a strong start for all children through high-quality early education and care. Third, accessible and more affordable post-secondary education and training, providing pathways to completion and employment. And I'll make a little plug that we are having a session in September that will focus on that particular priority. Fourth, a vibrant local arts and creativity ecosystem to support self-expression, economic vitality, and connection. And I will mention that is, we call it Valley Creates, and it's really focused on BIPOC artists, rural artists, and arts organizations that are led by traditionally marginalized communities. And our last, and by the way, on that, we are working on putting together a series of events specifically around Valley Creates that can connect our community to the creativity up and down the valley in new ways that may open eyes to things that are happening that people aren't even already aware of. And then last is charitable giving within our 3 counties and by marshaling resources from beyond. This particular session, as I mentioned, is really focused on the first priority, diversity, equity, and inclusion in what we do internally and the work that we do with the community. And that includes inspiring philanthropy and giving, neighbors helping neighbors. I really want to thank everyone who came out today. I particularly want to call out 2 trustees that are in the room, Doug Theobald and Nikki Burnett. Thank you very much for being here. We have the most amazing trustees. I've only been in the job for 6 months, and they have been so incredibly supportive, so I just want to do a quick call out. We also have a number of volunteers from some of our committees. I'm looking at Pat Crutchfield, who's on our distribution committee. We have Susan, who's on our education committee. I believe Robin Newhouse might be here from Philanthropic Services. Carrie Diamond Quiotes? Yes, yep. I said your last name wrong, but you smiled, so that's awesome. That's all I need. That's the encouragement I need. No, just kidding. But you know, I kind of flag that because, one, it's great that folks volunteer and support the community, and the Community Foundation has a number of ways to do that. So if you're hearing something where you're like, ooh, Philanthropic Services Committee, Education Committee, Distribution Committee, what's that? Please feel free to ask. We also have a former trustee, Mr. Sandy Belden, former chair of our trustees who's here, so that's awesome. So thank you very, very much. And with that, I'm going to call on my colleague, Nigel Greaves, and I will introduce him. He is our development director. He works on our philanthropic services team. He lives here in Springfield and has a lovely family. And he has been here for about 7 months. And in that time, he has been a whirlwind of activity to really think about what we do, how we do it, who we're reaching, and how we can open our doors wider. So with that, Nigel.
Very good. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
really glad to have everybody in the house today. This is really wonderful to see. Definitely opening your doors literally to utilize the space is really a good thing. So thank you for coming. Yes, so Megan pointed out that I've been here for 7 months on staff, but like Brianna, I was a volunteer as well for 4 years prior as a grants reviewer, scholarship application reviewer, and a member of the distribution committee as well for 2 years. And so not only have I been a little bit of a whirlwind since I got here on staff, I kind of was also involved a little bit in incorporating some of the equity work and implementing that strategic plan that was developed in 2018 and sort of sat with the foundation during that COVID period and learned a lot and hopefully contributed some as well. And certainly during that time period, this word equity has sort of risen to the top of the lexicon, certainly in our work of public service and nonprofit management, and particularly in philanthropy. So it caused me to ask some of these questions. Well, what does that really mean here? What does that really mean here? And so I started looking up. I started Googling. Honestly, Googling what are other people doing? What are some of the larger conversation going on elsewhere that we can also kind of continue to incorporate here. So there was in fact an article 5 years ago written on Medium. Everyone is talking about equity. Everyone is talking about equity. That was actually the name of the article. To explain what it means to her and her organization. This was the community foundation of the Triangle in North Carolina. Since that time, and then especially since I arrived, we tried to dive a little bit deeper into what it means. So I'm going to read the actual definition of the word equity. Forgive me if it's elementary, but I'm just going to bring it into the room. So equity is justice. One definition of it anyway is justice according to natural law or right, specifically freedom from bias or favoritism. It's one definition. Another definition, which also applies here, because we have a large amount of money that we manage. The other definition around equity has everything to do with money. It is the money value of a property or an interest in a property in excess of claims or liens against it. So it's sort of what we hold. What is that portion of what exists that we actually hold? And I feel like that sort of applies. So we've been trying to synthesize, what does not only equity, but within our department, what does equitable philanthropic practices mean? And so with all of this going on, I got into my whirlwind mode, I suppose, and started writing. So I wrote a little piece that helped me, and I hope has helped some of our staff and volunteers that I've been speaking with over this course of time to kind of walk through some steps. And it's mostly questions. And it's kind of broken up into 4 different segments of thought related to the foundation's work. And so one segment, for sure, that is most closely related to my function here is fundraising. And it's the money that we bring in. And so in that realm, we kind of have to ask ourselves some questions around, like, are fundraising materials available in different languages? What does our donor base look like, and how diverse is it? How do, to what extent are we educating our donors about our policies and practices in equity? And so that's one realm is fundraising. Another realm is grant making, right? And so within the world of grant making, we've made a lot of moves already in terms of aligning our work with equity. And in fact, there are a couple of frameworks out there already, one of which is pretty well known. It's called trust-based philanthropy, and it incorporates a lot of pieces that are aligned with equity. Another realm is our investments. So we bring money in, we send money out to nonprofits, but we also hold it to some extent. And what are we doing with that money? So there are questions there, but there's also a framework or two that help to think about whether or not our practices are aligned with equity, and one of which is ESG, environmental social governance reviews to investments that, that's been in the news recently. We won't get into all of that, but it's a way of thinking about how we hold the money. And then the fourth piece that I thought was important was, what outside resources do we rely on to inform us in all these other different elements of our work? What research papers, what philanthropic support groups do we think about or do we relate to or connect with? What does our staff and volunteer base look like? And are we bringing in different perspectives in that sense? So in all of these different ways, you kind of have to think about what goes into this notion of equitable philanthropic practice. Again, my main charge here is, as Director of Development, is to bring money in. I would be remiss if I didn't shout out my colleague, in particular, Maria Del Carmen, who, along with Joanna, I work most closely with in that capacity. I wanted to say at the very beginning, shout out to you for even coordinating today, because I don't want to forget to say that later. Maria Del Carmen is our Evolve events coordinator and really put a lot of work into bringing us in the room today, so thank you for that. But the charge is fundraising, but these elements, it occurs to me anyway, that these elements are sort of inextricable. They fold onto one another, and you can't think about one without thinking about the other. And so it was with much of that in mind, internal conversations among staff, volunteers. We said, all right, we need to broaden the conversation. Joanna was instrumental in sort of pushing for that, saying we got to bring some more folks in the room, and maybe we could use some outside thought leadership as well. So that sort of brings us to having a guest speaker, right? So Tanisha, thank you again for coming to join us. This is general. We have abundance here, but our learning has everything to do with how we can be in the practice of sharing that abundance more fairly and hopefully more frequently, leaning towards justice. And the scarcity question is one that might be overblown, but it's, I don't know, maybe becoming more of a problem. So that makes our work more important and more critical that we pay attention to this idea of equity. It's not just a word, it's not just, something in the lexicon that's floating around. It's something we really have to pay much closer attention to. And I'm glad we're in the room to do that, and I'm glad to have Tanisha here with us to lead us through the next hour and change of talking about that. So more about Tanisha. So Tanisha Arena is a Black woman, author, and public speaker in community, occupying the world's messiest intersection. The space where race, gender, culture, identity, politics, and the law collide. All right? I didn't mean to collide. She's also a commissioner with the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women, advocating for the needs of women and girls across the Commonwealth, as well as being the host of an award-winning podcast, Unapologetic, bringing the hard truths of our social issues to the forefront and connecting the past to the present. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining us today, and please, a round of applause for Tanisha Arena.
You're about to get unapologetic, I guess, foundation of Christian. Stick it in my pocket. Okay, and shout out to Jake for the tech. As I was explaining to folks, I'm a lifelong PC user, and then I decided to buy a Mac. And it's been stressful. So put on a thumb drive, here it is. And yeah, let's talk about equitable philanthropic practices in our work together, because I'm on the other side, right? My day job, I run the Rise for Social Justice, it's over there on School Street. And what you all do in terms of funding, grant making, donations does have an impact. Now, before I get started, I'm gonna give us some grounding guidelines, right? When I'm not running a Rise, I'm a consultant for an organization called Growing a New Heart, and we train around dialogues across differences, where we teach people how to have hard conversations. So I've used these with their express permission, and I've got these two arrows up here, and that's the tension, right? gonna say some things that's gonna test you and have you sitting in the tension of what you believe and already value. And I'm gonna introduce something different that might actually challenge that. That's these hot coals, right? Has anybody in here ever walked on hot coals? To Maria's point, people who pay good money to walk across hot coals can spend more time practicing and being mentally prepared to walk across the hot coals, and then you walk across the hot coals. So this is that space of the preparation, like we are gonna walk across hot coals, right? And set some tension. And then this one right here with the insight, that's basically like our Zoom Vegas clause, or we're in person, oh my gosh, we're in person, right? So if there's personal information, stories and things that get shared in the space, we'll keep it here. And whatever lessons, we can take that with us. So these are guidelines. Should we add anything? Would this suffice for our time together? Okay, cool. All right. I'm gonna go back in history because we can't address the things forward in creating this equity if we don't understand the inequity that we have in all of these areas. So I'm like, how did this happen? Right? Philanthropy, I gotta give money to these causes, right? So whether it's about the environment, housing, food, ballot box census, voting, these systems and institutions, and even our way of trying to solve these complex problems using the same methods that created them. You can't really do that. The environment and capitalism, build the natural, right? So when we're talking about the natural environment, it's all here, right? We're cutting down the forest, these things are happening, climate change is real, there's a heat advisory coming up. Capitalism says the forest is worth more when the trees are cut down. Look at the placement of farms, factories, highways, proposed biomass plants. Shout out to Springfield where I do live and work, and they've been trying to put a biomass plant here for 13, 14 years now. And up until last year, this was the asthma capital of the country. Why do you want to do that here? Housing. It's on the books, discrimination, redlining. This matters. There's a video that's going to play. It's about 6 minutes long. I don't know if we'll have to go through the whole thing. So all that. It's in the policy. We'll say housing is a human right, but not everybody has adequate housing. Who gets defined in human? Like seriously, you have things on the books, the fabric of the country. And what happens when you lump everybody together? Redlining, redistricting, the dilution of voting power. We're going to talk about funding, but under-resourced communities create the conditions that are ripe for violence, whether we're talking about immigrant communities, refugee communities, Black and brown communities, the ones that are chronically under-resourced, that philanthropy is trying to fund. Poverty is violence. Suburban versus urban communities. You take a look at the housing stock, the built environment. We have a mold issue here in Springfield. We have a houselessness issue. I'm not going to call it homelessness or house. There's lots of empty spaces here in Springfield, but it's policy. Cash rules everything around me. Cream, get the money. Dollar, dollar bill, y'all. Capitalism. And I put it in here intentionally, and I try to make things relevant. Like this is what it is. From environmental injustice, the housing crisis, food deserts, criminal injustice, police brutality, the underpinning is the same. Money. Well, white supremacy and racism upheld by capitalism. And if you want to know who benefits, follow the money trail, because the money is the motivator. And everything is fair game. And the thing that I'm struggling with in some of the spaces that I'm navigating is that there are folks who want the rules to stay the same because they benefit from exactly what it is. And I've said this, and I'm going to keep saying this, we cannot outfund bad policy. You're talking about not a hole in the bottom of the bucket. The bucket has no bottom. Right? I'm sitting in the community foundation. If y'all say, Tanisha, we will give a rise $100 million to take care of houselessness in Springfield, I'll go, oh, that's great. But it's not going to actually change the thing, because there's a policy that supports people being unhoused. I'll take the $100 million. I'm saying.
Let me get the checks.
Thank you. Grab it on the way out. We'll just cycle it around.
Yep.
And if you're a donor to a foundation, you're giving money, we'll keep cycling it around because we have to look at this policy. White supremacy, I said it. It's the Windows 10 of our society, and I've been saying that just like this computer is running. You're in your Zoom meetings, you're not thinking about what's happening in your computer, you're opening the windows, all the things. It's just running. It's always in the background, right? There are folks who want us to say white supremacy instead of structural racism, but here are some examples of structural racism, right? Genocide, slavery, Jim Crow, the red line, Alabama, now. Dred Scott. But that was back then, right? Nah. Tulsa, 2023, case dismissed, akin to this ruling and these implications, right? Again, the fabric says certain groups of people, you don't have any rights that another group of people have to respect. Why is that important? Because if you're coming up with solutions to alleviate the problems, how are you going to do it with this operating system? Everything that you put into your Windows computer has to run through Windows. So that means even the things that we come up with are going to run through this operating system that runs with these specific set of rules that places an order on the people in it, right? The communities that are chronically under-resourced, those are the ones like, oh yeah, we don't really care about those so much, or we haven't had to because of the history. This is the actual language from Dred Scott. All men are created equal. However, there were some that were never supposed to be citizens of the United States. Never. And the implications of that, which is why Tulsa 2023 now is like, we don't have any laws in the books. You don't show up in this way to be considered human, that we have to respect your loss of property, your loss of life, your loss of anything. That's what, who's human? But housing's a human right. But who's unhoused? Who's worried about the biomass plant, right? Or any of the societal ills. And it's on the books. If you can't grasp it with it being the Windows 10, think of high fructose corn syrup, right? You go looking at a jar and you're like, oh my gosh, send that too. That's how all of this is. You could look at a policy, you read through it, and you're like, oh my gosh, send that too. It's in that too. It's in everything because that's the operating system. By white supremacy, I do not mean to allude only to the self-conscious racism of white supremacist hate groups. I refer instead to a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. That's from legal scholar Francis Lee Ainsley. Now, I will say, whiteness, I'm not talking about the color of your skin. It's a sick social contract that you will agree to that has certain terms and conditions, right? Rafael Eduardo Cruz is Cuban. Ted Cruz is white. It's the same guy. But you will agree to giving up your cultural identity, you will drop the vowel at the end of your name, you will give up the wisdom of your grandmother, your spices, all the pieces that make you culturally to do this thing of whiteness. Clarence Thomas is white. See, not about your skin color, it's the things that you'll agree to do. And it upholds this. Power and material resources. I'll show you, it's a lot of money, right? There is no scarcity. If workers lost $38 billion over the pandemic, but billionaires gained $38 billion, there's no scarcity. The money changed hands. Now, it's supposed to be a DEI conversation, kind of sort of. But I don't do DEI work, and I keep telling people that because this, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. But inclusion into what? that becomes a thing. Here, I screenshot these because they're great, right? I've said it before and I'll say it again. DEI is the institutional version of I have black friends, so I can't be racist. Right? They don't want diversity that challenges the status quo. And it's everywhere, including its dominant culture. Our systems and institutions, our funders, stakeholders, our organizations. And we did have this great racial awakening. And I'm telling you, being on the other side, it was like a free-for-all. Because there was a scrambling. Oh my gosh, apply for this grant. Just do something. And money was just like falling out of the sky, I swear. There's no scarcity when it's the cool thing to do or just what's happening at the time. But was that transformative work or was it performative? Because what did it really change? Right? And if it's rooted in dominant culture, it's about preserving the feelings, but not really taking care of the feelings of marginalized or oppressed groups and changing what really needs to change. That's back to that policy thing, right? I fixed it for you. What is the philanthropic version of thoughts and prayers? Transformation, though. Can we evolve? Right? So here are these questions. How do you create equity in inequitable systems? How long? How many times will we fund the same things generation after generation? I do this work. My organization relies on the funding dollars of individuals and foundations that believe in our mission. I live this work as someone with multiple marginalized identities, right? And I'm in it, needing systemic and institutional change as all of my rights are currently subjected to judicial interpretation. Current and historic harms impacting my community and family. Every single last one of them. The judge decides, hey, we're not doing that anymore. We're not doing that anymore. I need us to evolve. I put the slide in here. I know her. What got this started was when Roe was overturned. Being here in Massachusetts, our then Attorney General says, hey, we're good in Massachusetts, we'll protect the rights. Well, yeah, great. That's Penelope. She is the first daughter born to the first daughter with the first daughter. And it says, why should she have the same problems as her great grandmother who's still alive, because that's my mother. And how do you have problems generation after generation after generation? And then you've got President Biden. From the very beginning, nothing's been guaranteed about democracy. In America, every generation has had to defend it, preserve it, choose it. It's a choice. But why every generation? Right? That's us funding the same things over and over and over again, right? It's like, no, we have to start doing something different. And that gets us to this place. When we start talking about this equity, right? Create the conditions that allow all to reach their full potential, right? Giving people what they need, whatever that thing is to be successful, the resources, the policies, the practices, the fair distribution of power and opportunity. Now, Michelle sent me some cool reading materials. No, it was good. Right? One of the first things I learned as an organizer is that there are two kinds of power, money and people. Our side doesn't have the money, so we need the people. That's Nina Lowe from our article, Money and Power. Move back to this again. The revolution will not be funded. When we talk about the gatekeeping role of well-connected white liberals and private philanthropy played in doling out money to poor people of color, those BIPOC organizations, the under-resourced communities, right? The organizations working with refugee populations or immigrants, like all that, the under-resourced communities, that racial awakening, foundations, individual donors, donor advisors, consultants, diversified everything. We're gonna spend down this money. It was great, it was a free-for-all, it was. But the policy though, it didn't change, right? Same thing. We cannot outfund bad policy. If you want to know who benefits, always follow the money trail. Funders, I think y'all talk to each other. Don't you know? Having a clear strategy based on an analysis of power and outcomes, right? So this thing, you have to know the history and what's woven into the fabric. The operating system, it's here, even in those spaces of how are we going to shift, you know, our investments, how are we going to give out our grants, right? It's in there, it's baked into everything that we do. It's the high fructose corn syrup, it's in there. Until you take it out, you're intentional about it not being there. That's how you create the equity, right? The policy creates the conditions that philanthropy is tasked with helping to alleviate.
Yeah.
And then philanthropy sometimes asks us to do the work in the ways that uphold the problems. And then I'm stressed out of my office at work. Okay, how if I'm that policy? Sometimes it's single issue work, ideological fights, or long-term institution building, and it's too many scrappy organizations, and we're competing against each other. And it's like, how many organizations are in a small area doing the same kinds of work, don't work together, and we are competing for funding dollars? Right here in Springfield. Always bring it home, it's local. Doing the same thing and not working together, or being allowed to work together to really get at the structural things. Funders and foundations don't want organizations to be dependent on them, right? And they're not addressing the systemic and institutional issues that are being upheld by the policy that drives the need for nonprofit organizations in the first place. And that's me sitting on the side of running a nonprofit organization and applying for grant funding. You hear all of the things like, well, how are you able to sustain this if we aren't giving you this money anymore? It's like, this is an ongoing thing. Like, how you... Oh, I hate it here. But money is the thing, right? Because we bring, get the money, right? You can use this money in a way to strengthen your position, weaken your opponents. Money drives the strategy. And then there's this thing too about the less work that the organization does, the more money it seems to get. I'm like, I should be on vacation more. Just not get some more money, right? And I want you to see the connection between the philanthropy, the history, the politics, legislation, voting, and our current situation. So that's why I've taken you down this rabbit hole. And these are my notes. Because I switched from a PC to a Mac and I have this, right? It's like, how do I make a circle diagram? This is what it is. So it's like, okay, here I'm going to show up, I got these beliefs and values, and they're going to show up voting time, elections, right? And so you've voted, your candidate gets in the office, and they've introduced policy, and it's supporting your values, right? Because that's why you voted for them. And maybe there's low to no taxes, there's less regulations. Like, oh, I work for all the things that I've got. So like, yeah, I want this candidate. That's rooted in historic practices with white supremacy and racism. I just slapped an example here of housing. No rent control. Then took it back to James Madison, government to protect the opulent minority in their economic status, right? So if government's upholding that, it's like, okay, cool, no taxes, I work for all I got, that's great. Government's gonna protect me, roll back regulations and policies that would help me, right? But they'll hurt everybody else. So I'm making my money in real estate and property, so that's why I don't want rent control. But yet rent control, the absence of it, is driving houselessness as a policy. But you care about homelessness and unhoused people, but you might not see the connection like, oh wait, but there's no rent control. Because you want to call it something else, oh, people aren't working hard enough, blah, blah, but yet minimum wage has been $7.25 since forever. And a recent study, the average person needs like $95,000 a year just to make ends meet in anywhere in this country. A studio apartment in Springfield is like $1,200. So, in the absence of rent control, I mean, our minimum wage is $15. It's okay, but it's not enough because people still have to choose between paying my rent, I need gas in my car, I have childcare, all of the things. The absence of this policy that you supported up there is driving this. You care about this, so you're making donations to organizations, shelters, but not making the connection between the politics, the policy, and the conditions that it creates. That's the thing that I need you to see in terms of philanthropy. How you show up as an individual donor, what's happening in the collective, the investments, what's happening, because the policy is creating the conditions that we need the philanthropy for anyway. So, oh, can you fix this? Like, yeah, sure, fix it, but we gotta change that. If you don't change that, then yeah, I'll have job security for a really long time. But Penelope, though, how many generations? So, there's other, y'all trying to win or not? Philanthropy has forced U.S. social movements to take part, and this is it's a means of survival, right? So in conversations with funders, with grantees, and we are pushed to present failures as victory to keep up appearances, because they want outcomes, and if you don't have the outcomes, then you won't get more funding because you didn't achieve the outcome, right? But then, not having that transparency about the things that don't work, like you not knowing these pieces behind the scenes or being able to connect the dots, it makes it harder for grantees to evolve. It makes it harder for philanthropy to evolve. It makes it, you can't shift. And the organizations are rewarded are the ones that carrying out the most politically disciplined and effective work, but it's the ones that play the money game the best. And it doesn't change. It's like you benefit from the problems that you signed up to solve. That's why you're not solving them. Transformation. Can we evolve? Back to this again. On the road to social justice, philanthropic supports for racial equity must do 3 things to drive change. Lift, clear, and push. Lift the wise and experienced voices within BIPOC communities in charting the course. Clear roadblocks from the paths to serving people and shifting power, and then push resources behind effective initiatives led by Black and brown folks. Nigel agrees. This, right? It fits, right? Knowing the behind the scenes information, the invisibility, that Windows 10 that's running, and it's running, you say, oh, it's broken. It's not broken. This is a well-oiled machine, and it is machining the best it has ever machined, I promise you, right? Lift the voices. Yes, I'm standing here. Thank y'all, right? Clearing the roadblocks. The biggest roadblock is the dang policy. And it keeps being the roadblock. You can't shift the power without changing the policy or changing the people who create the policy, because it's creating the conditions, right? Which is why that push for resources. Change the policy that creates the conditions for the under-resourcing or the over-resourcing, because there are lots of spaces and places where there's over-resourcing. Changing the narrative about the scarcity, because it's not scarce. It's held in place. For the community foundation, for other foundations that get donations, have individual donors, all that. What I said to Nigel and Maria Del Carmen in our conversation was like, hey, how about educating donors about these pieces? Because literally, are you supporting electeds or in spaces like that are creating the problems that then you're sending your money to go solve? Like, we just keep going around and around and around. Like, I want us to stop going around and around and around, because being in it, the work of it, the life of it, it's exhausting. And the way to make it shift, you gotta know that it's there. That's why I'm like you got to understand the history. Like, everything that we do is rooted from that place. And it's not just in the past. Case in point, we're gonna use these laws from way back then to justify the things that we're doing now. I will shift history to make it be more palatable and comfortable. That's Florida. Talking Florida. Right? If you know that it's there, you can talk about it in your spheres of influence and say, hey, we can collectively come together and shift how we're making donations and where we want that money to go to organizations that are doing this heavy lift and calling out the white supremacy and racism, the policies that's driving it. Because there is a push for it to continue to be invisible, deeply hidden, if we're not going to teach history. Because then you would get to see all of these things, and it's there. It's literally not a secret. It's really not. Part of that evolution has to be naming it in all of the spaces and places, because it is in all of the spaces and places. Unless you intentionally take it out. We have a cake that was made with bad eggs. You can't take the eggs out. You gotta make a new cake. So this evolution, how do we work together? Let's talk about making a new cake. And what that can look like. So, my friend Reggie talks about doing cutting edge. And if you're gonna do cutting edge things, it means you have to do cutting edge things. This is from our t-shirt parade, become ungovernable, and there's nothing more ungovernable than a duck with a butter knife. Be radical, right? Specifically fund BIPOC organizations on the ground doing the work that names and seeks to dismantle the systems, systemic issues to stop the cyclical nature, right? Be unapologetic, throw political correctness and decorum out the window, because people's lives are at stake. Like across every single intersection. And that goes back to the history point. If you are not a cisgender, heterosexual, rich, white man with Christian faith, this is not for you. And if you think about where you sit, if you are outside in any kind of way, if you are a woman, if you are a person of color, if you are black, and I make the distinction because you can be a person of color and be anti-black, and that also drives a lot of this policy, right? If you are disabled, if you are an immigrant, if you are not a native English speaker, if you are a Muslim, if you are, again, outside, it's gonna catch you, right? People's lives are at stake. Be on purpose. Know not only where your money is going, but where and how it originated and sustains. And what you do in the voting booth has consequences. Elections have consequences, right? Are you voting for the creation or continuation of issues that you want philanthropy to fix? You can't go in the voting booth and do the thing, right? Vote for the person that's gonna harm people and then think that because you cut a check over here, that it's gonna absolve you from the thing that happened over here. It's going to be unpalatable. It's going to be ugly. It's going to challenge the status quo because we've been doing this for a long time. But we don't want to do it anymore. And that's how I would love to see us work together in creating equity and philanthropy. To be united and say, we don't want to do this anymore, this dominant culture, this way of being that has harmed everybody. Like forever. Let's talk about that, right? Let's evolve that way. Now we got time to